How old could be the ancient Egyptian civilization? Could it be thousands or even tens of thousands years older than it is envisioned by the modern Egyptologists? In this episode, we shall see how really ancient or prehistoric could be the ancient Egyptian civilization. My name is Alexander, and in this episode we shall see how old is ancient Egyptian civilization according not only to the texts found here in Egypt, but also to the direct evidence in the form of the artifacts and monuments and their alignments, for example with some specific stars or zodiac constellations. But in order to understand that the ancient Egypt could be much older than it is thought by modern Egyptology, we firstly shall see how they envision it officially. So, according to the modern dogma, the history of the ancient Egypt started about 3100 BC. During this time, the Upper and Lower Egypts were unified by the pharaoh Narmer, also called Menes. And before that unification of this Upper and Lower Egypt, in Egypt there were only small towns or small centers, and before that there was no actual civilization, and there existed only some small locations with some buildings made from mud brick or from reeds. And actually there were no huge monuments. And about 3100 BC, Pharaoh Narmer or Menes unified both the Upper and Lower Egypt, thus creating the actual ancient Egyptian empire. And actually about a few 400 to 500 years later, the Great Pyramid was built, which till the erection of the Eiffel Tower in Paris was the largest monument on our planet. So as we see, these beginnings of the ancient Egyptian civilization are very shadowy and actually are very inconsistent with the actual text from the ancient Egypt. And the whole chronology of this ancient Egyptian civilization is based mostly on the three textual evidence, which are 1. The Turin's Kings list, now found in museum in Turin, Italy, which is also called the Turin's Canon. The list of kings of Manetho. Manetho was the 3rd century historian and chronicler under the reign of the Ptolemies in Alexandria, and he composed the history of ancient Egypt from the oldest times, as we will see in a moment. And the 3rd is the Palermo stone, which is actually dated to circa 2400 BC and which contains the information about the beginnings of the ancient Egyptian civilization. All of those 3 main evidence and 3 main sources are more or less consistent, not to mention a few dates which are not consistent, and they all actually present the same monarchs, the same kings, the same pharaohs in the same chronological order, and the mainstream Egyptology is based on those accounts with just slight variations of the datings. And actually we cannot tell the exact dates of, for example, monuments or many of the artifacts, because our modern dating methods are mostly based on for example, the carbon C14, on the radioactive decay, and actually the inorganic matter do not have this carbon 14 to decay and to calculate its date, so we cannot date most of the inorganic objects such as monuments or artifacts. Only pottery can be dated by the method called the thermoluminescence, but it is another thing. So it is hard actually to distinguish and to tell the exact chronological order of the ancient Egyptian civilization. But Just as the modern Egyptology accepts this version from those three sources, from those Turin's canon, from the Palermo stone, and from the Manetho's Kings list, they actually started their datings with the 3100 BC with this unification of the pharaoh Narmer or Menes, but actually they ignored the previous mentions of the previous rulers, which are all contained within these three sources, and which tell us about a completely different history and completely different roots of the ancient Egyptian civilization. And according to all of those texts, before Menes, before the actual human pharaohs in Egypt, there existed, for example, demigods, gods, and other divine rulers who were ruling for thousands or even tens of thousands of years before the Menes unified the Egypt. And actually, all of those texts, the Turin's canon, the Manetho's Kings list, and the Palermo stone are consistent that these rulers, these divine rulers, were ruling ancient Egypt in the deep prehistory tens of thousands of years ago. And actually from the Manetho's Kings list, for example, they would go back to about 39,000 years BC. So as we see into deep prehistory, when according to modern view no civilization existed, and actually humankind was living as primitive hunter-gatherers, having primitive lifestyle of the nomads, and there were no settlements at that time. But actually we are starting to pushing the history of the civilization further and further back in time. And actually, for example, the Göbekli Tepe, the site in Turkey, which actually dates back to about 9600 BC, is the best evidence for it, because it contains megalithic monuments which are would be very hard to be built by primitive hunter-gatherers, and which may indicate that in the distant past there actually were some settlements. And as we see, this history of the ancient Egypt was, according to our own ancestors of the ancient Egypt, were pushed back to about 39,000 years before present. And also it is worth mentioning the direct evidence from the ancient Egyptian monuments. For example, Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval actually created a theory according to which the three Great Pyramids in Giza are aligned to the Orion constellation, and these three stars of Orion are very characteristic, and we can clearly see that these three pyramids are closely aligned to the Orion constellation. But according to Bauval and Hancock, this look of the Orion constellation was not the same at the time of the pharaoh Khufu, who is, according to mainstream Egyptology, was the builder of the Great Pyramid of Giza, but actually it was this Orion constellation alignment would be dated back to about 10,500 BC, which is also the deep prehistory in which our ancestors were primitive hunter-gatherers. But as this theory may sound as just one evidence, which is just some correlation of the stars and pyramids, we've got many more evidence. For example, the Great Sphinx, which is accompanying the three pyramids, was actually looking at the summer solstice at the vernal equinox at the great constellation of Leo during the epoch of between 12,000 to 10,500 BC, because there are the zodiacal epochs of every constellation, of every zodiac sign, and the constellation of Leo was seen, and actually the Sphinx was seeing it on the horizon on the epoch of 12,000 to 10,500 BC. And as we see, we've got direct evidence that the ancient Egyptian civilization may really go further back in time, and actually that our ancient ancestors telling us that it could go back tens of thousands of years ago could have been right. And actually the pyramids of Giza, according, for example, to the Hermetic texts or the Arab chroniclers of the Middle Ages, was supposed to be built by the god of wisdom Thoth. And it's very interesting because according to those lists of kings, Thoth was ruling before about 9 to 10,000 BC, which would be consistent with the datings of the pyramids to about 10,500 BC by this Orion constellation alignment. So as we see, we've got further evidence to indicate that the whole ancient Egyptian civilization could be much older than it is commonly thought by modern Egyptologists. It is also worth adding that, according to those texts, the pyramids of Giza were built before the Great Flood occurred, and actually, as I'm speaking on this channel, the Great Flood is not a single myth or a single story from the Bible, for example, the most famous Noah's flood, but is consistent within the cultures all over the world, and actually researchers counted about 2,000 stories of the Great Deluge, which are connected with the last ice age, about which I was talking in my other videos. And during the end of the last ice age, there were sudden meltwaters, and those meltwaters actually sank the region on the entire globe, the area of about 25 million square kilometers, which is more than modern North America, and actually could sink the legendary city of Atlantis, which was described by Plato in his two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. And the Atlantis was supposed to be an ancient advanced civilization of the distant past, which sank about 9600 BC, which coincides with the end of the last ice age and of this catastrophe that could have led to this sudden end and to the sudden melting of the waters of the glaciers and to those sudden inundations all over the world. So as we see, if Thoth built the pyramids before the flood, and if the flood was really the event of the last ice age, it could further validate that the pyramids of Giza were built before 9600 BC, so why not 10,500 BC, just as the Orion constellation alignment theory tells us. It is also worth noting that, for example, according to prophet Edgar Cayce, also called the Sleeping Prophet, who lived at the beginning of the 20th century and who was making very accurate prophecies, the pyramids of Giza were built about between 10,490 and 10,390 BC, which also is consistent with not only our ancient ancestors' texts of those lists of kings, but also with those alignments of the stars or the story of the Great Flood. So as we see, it all makes sense, and it all creates a logical whole and another and a very different picture of our very distant past than it is envisioned by modern Egyptologists, archaeologists, and historians. If you want to hear more about the Edgar Cayce and the pyramid connection and other metaphysical sources, you can comment down below, and I will make other videos concerning mostly those other metaphysical sources. That's all for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also to share this video so more and more people could be watching it and could be getting this very important and interesting information that could completely rewrite our history. That's all for today. Thanks for watching, and till the next video. Goodbye.